Okay, so maybe we just begin today. So I just want to say hello. My name is Quinn Latimer. I'm a writer and an editor and the head of the MA program at Institut Kunst, Gender, Nature in Basel. And I'm really happy to be moderating this panel with Emily, Aisha, Madeline, and Agnieszka on the work of Hannah Villiger. I think Hannah's work is somehow, to everybody I know in Switzerland, especially people who are involved in issues of performance and feminism and language and image making, her work has had a somehow profound impact in very different ways. So to that end, I thought we might consider on this panel today Hannah's body of work within the guise of language and writing, and more specifically technologies of gender and grammar and the performance of language itself. Since everyone here today contributed to the very wonderful Amaze Me catalog for the exhibition, Muzeum Susch, it seemed like a very pertinent approach. So I thought maybe we would begin then just by talking about and asking actually Madeline, the co-curator of the show, about this idea of fragmentation, because I know that you wrote about it a bit. And I think that in my in all of my sort of interactions, engagement with Hannah's work, I've thought about her work of sort of parceling out and fragmenting the female body, her body, as a kind of grammar, kind of somehow always relating it to building up a kind of visual language, and almost this kind of medieval self-blazoning of the female body, separating it into parts and then reordering it, remaking it. And so I wanted to ask about how you engage with her work, how you maybe thought about beginning with this show, and then really about your sort of approach to fragmentation in her practice.
I mean, I curated the show together with Yasmin Afshar, and the two of us thought that Hannah Villiger is really still a very important artist, but there hasn't been a show on her for quite some time. And that we think also that her practice is very actual, so it's very based, also anchored in the contemporary, and it's really important that we discuss it today from a contemporary perspective, because Hannah Villiger, she died in 1997, so it's quite some years ago that when her practice stopped. And I actually, for the, as you were mentioning, Quinn, for the catalog, I focused on the theme of the fragment, because I thought that the fragment is quite of a central or crucial theme in the work of Hannah Villiger. As we all know, it's mainly her own body that was the subject to her in her photographic work. And she never ever shows her body as a whole, as a unity. And that is, of course, somehow caused in the technique that she's using with the Polaroid camera, because she's the photographer and she's the object, so she's subject and object at the same time. So it would be technically not possible to have a complete view on her own body. So that is already, at least the hand is cut off, and must be, the hand with the camera must be outside of the image frame. But of course, she goes much further with that, and while her work is progressing, it gets more and more complex, and more and more she focuses on details of her body. And then when it gets really interesting is also how she then recomposes these fragments together in the blocks. That she starts in the 80s already, but then further on in her work, mainly in the 90s, she does these very complex blocks where with the fragments, she constructs something new then.
Yeah. I mean, I think she has this beautiful line where she says, I just have this here. My aim is not to just represent a given, but to create an autonomous work of art. To this end, I use the means of painting, sculpture, performance, and photography. Persistent repetition turns my body into a body. And I think this is interesting, this persistent repetition. And as you spoke about, this fragmentation that then she sort of uses these different sort of fragments and close-ups of the body to constantly build new bodies and to build sort of new sentences along this line. And I guess this sort of leads me into thinking about what we're actually seeing in those blocks as you brought them up. And one of the things we're often seeing is skin and surface. And I think skin is somehow one of the, it's like, it's sort of it's the field, it's what we're looking at constantly. And it turns it, moves between sort of the human and the biological to the vegetal and the parchment and the arboreal and fabric and so forth. And so I wanted to ask you all, I guess, about this idea of surface and skin and how you consider it in terms of her framing and in terms of this kind of all over and ambient quality that often happens. Because when we think about fragments and details of the body, we're thinking about seeing specific things like a knee, a breast, a chin, an arm, but actually what we're often seeing is a kind of field. It's something a bit more all over. So how do you consider this in your approach? Maybe I should, like in your essay, for instance.
I actually started with the skin for the reasons that you just mentioned, because that's, when you start interacting with Hannah Villiger's work, that's what you see. And what I'm really interested in, and what I think is so fascinating, is that you sort of have this very consistent insistence almost in flatness. You mentioned this sort of all over. And I think it's really interesting because her work can be perceived as being very sculptural, three-dimensional, but at the same time, she seems to, in these blocks, to insist in a very sort of flat surface. And so I started thinking about the skin and what it represents and its porousness, its quality, if you will, and how it translates and doesn't translate in the form that she uses with the Polaroid, and how the quality of the Polaroid translates then in the C print, how it transforms, if you will. And then I started looking at her older works, or, one can argue whether they're really considered, all of them are considered works or not, but that's not really something I'm concerned about, but how she approached other materials, other surfaces. And I started noticing that actually this sort of interest in surfaces didn't start in the 1980s when she started photographing her own body. It started much earlier when she was interested in leaves, in tree bark, in other surfaces, and she started to interact with them, to manipulate them, to sort of peel away different layers. And then, Madeleine talked about fragmentation just before, and what I think is just as important is the synthesis that then happens. It's never just fragmentation that she's sort of interested in. It's always a synthesis as well. And Quinn, you just mentioned this sort of parallels between the skin, the body, and the natural world. And that's something I'm actually interested now in, how this sort of synthesis of disparate fragments, how they come together and they don't form a coherent body that, adheres to the bodily schema. And these bodies are not necessarily gendered. They're not even necessarily human. And that's what I think is maybe something that is also interesting to talk about. I think there has been quite a lot of talk about how these images do not look like traditional nude photography, but the bodies that she's showing us, or that sort of maybe appear in our perception, when we look at her works, are not even necessarily always human-looking bodies. And that's what I'm interested in right now. And I think that's very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting thinking about, I contributed to a book that the Swiss Institute in Rome put out a year or two ago. And so I was concentrating, and the show for them like really concentrated on her period in her early 20s in Rome. I think her 3 years she had there, where, as I'm sure you all know, that she was sort of emphasizing these palm fronds and making sort of these ritualistic objects out of them, but also lighting them on fire and photographing them in these kind of wonderful performances. And I think, and then this, of course, led to the photographs that she took of the trees in Basel and sort of bark and these other kinds of skins and surfaces, as you were talking about. But I thought this was actually quite interesting, this movement between human skin and the human kind of surface and field and the arboreal and the vegetal, and how little of a distance there somehow was between them, that there was this kind of psychoanalytical depth and maybe even thinking about terms of like technologies of gender and feminism in the way she approached these surfaces, even though the bodies, as you would say, were not specifically gendered. I mean, I think gender is not ever very far away from her work. But when you think about these surfaces, as you say, they seem both human and non-human. They seem sort of about the conversation between somehow. And maybe that could lead us into a discussion maybe more about performance somehow, which I think Agnieszka and Emily, you both broached a bit in your text in the catalog. And I guess maybe beginning with Emily, this idea of, I love that you kind of situated, I mean, many people have, but the sort of palindrome of Hannah, of the name, and then thinking about this in terms of performance and feminism and the performance of language. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you thought about her work in your essay?
Sure. Yeah, I was quite struck that a lot has been written about Hannah Villiger in terms of sculpture and photography and how she was a sculptor and she considered herself a sculptor. But she also worked with performance, and she said that in this text, Nade. But I was interested in this, not, I suppose, performance in the traditional, 1970s sense of performing for a public, but more performing in the privacy of her studio. So thinking about performativity. So performing for a public that would be experiencing it within the exhibition space. And this was tied into her thinking about sculpture. I was quite puzzled by this kind of initial statement that she said that she was working in sculpture. And I gradually came to understand it, that she's thinking of sculpture in the expanded sense. So she's thinking about the relations of, initially the relations of objects within a space. And gradually through, her photographing these sculptures, she came to use her body as a sculptural material in a performative sense. And the object disappeared altogether and it just came focused on her body. Mm-hmm. And this kind of led me also to really thinking about the relationship with language, because it's through language that we understand the activity that is taking place, be it performative or sculptural. And she used language by titling the works. So initially she kind of used the term Arbeit to talk about her work, but then she came to call them sculptures and then sculptural. So there's very much this idea of an action taking place that she's capturing in photography, which also, I suppose, led to me being really interested in this statement that you said earlier about using her body almost like a grammar. This is something that Griselda Pollock also talked about, like this idea of grammar of defamiliarized body forms. And so she's using this idea of repetition of the different poses, like a body part that she repeats in so many different ways, and puts together in a grid, in a block, and you can read it in many different ways. So hence the link to the reference to the palindrome that I was talking about and that Ichikuriga also picked up on.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think this idea of like the performance of the body, the performance of language, I think, yeah, there's something also really interesting. I mean, we've talked about fragmentation with Madeleine, and Aisha's talked about flatness and the expanded field of her images. But I think what's really interesting is also the concept of the gap and what's not there in the image. So the empty space around her body in the image, the kind of shadows, or what she makes apparent by using a mirror in the image.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I think, also really ties into her interest in language. So this idea of like the deconstruction of the image, what becomes apparent by, you know, what's making what is not there. I guess, yeah.
Absolutely. And that also seems to then go back to this idea of the sculptural or of sculpture, because I think one of the things that's like very literally overpowering about her blocks and about her works is the scale. So even though in some sense they might be flat and they might be photographs, because of the scale of them and because of the enlargement of what you're seeing and its relationship to your body, in some ways, I think one approaches her works as you approach sculpture. You know, when you're in a space and there's a sculpture in the middle of the space and you walk around it and you're kind of looking at it in different angles and in fragmented forms, she's somehow creating this experience with a flat image. And I think it's an incredible technique, and it's quite overpowering. And in that sense, her works can be seen as sort of sculptural or sculptors in their own right. But I think I wondered too once if, like, you know, if a photographer can call themselves a sculptor, then maybe a photographer would also be a writer somehow. And I think, again, this like relationship between feminist practice and language, and this idea of sort of like writing the female body down and like writing your body and sort of parsing it out, it has so much relationship to her work. And maybe this also goes to elements of sort of control and liberation, which Agnieszka, you talk about in your essay. And I think this is really interesting, this title of yours, Body Beyond Gender. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, about how her work for you sits both within and outside constructs of gender as we understand it.
Maybe it's good to start to answer this question through entering the gallery and like coming back to this like very basic experience of watching her artworks in the gallery, and also to come back to the issue of a fragment, which was already mentioned, because we have there is some sort of paradox. When we think about the fragment, we also very often think about the focus, blow up, that we can see better. And the paradox of Hannah Villiger work is that very often in her work we see so little. Yes, which of course also bring us to the issue of representation, and what you have already mentioned, like representation of a female body in general, out of gender. And then the other issue, which it's I think very important to catch, this issue of control, lacking of control. It's also the situation in which she was making her artworks, which brings us to the notion of a performance as a situation, because this is also for how she made her artworks, that the situation in which they were made, that very often she was photographing her body, but she was really not able, from one side, she could not see the picture that will happen. That's why very often they are unfocused, yes, because she could not control it. But from another side, what the Polaroid camera gave or enabled as a medium was this, that she had this very quick access to the effect of her work, and then through this she could control it and correct it. Yes, so take once again the image, make it exactly the way she wants. of course, when you just take a look at her works, if we just ask ourselves if this is feminine body, what sort of body it is, it's not so easy, I think, to answer, because of course there are some works in which the gender is visible and in other totally not. Then of course I think this the quotation you just mentioned from the beginning and the notion of a body here, it's very interesting. What does it mean that what she expressed, that her aim was to create a body, yes, a body which would be somehow, we could imagine, universal, yes, but what does it mean, a universal body then? Does it mean a body that doesn't show not at all a gender? Also, in terms of this almost obsessive act of photographing herself, not for 1 year, for so many years, this also brings a bit another notion that how long, that's why this research was so long, yes? Like we have other example of artists who had this practice, this obsessive practice of, maybe not like we had in Poland, for example, Roman Opałka, this very known artist, was all his years making the numbers, yes, and making these pictures out of numbers. There is some sort of similarity that she was really like searching. Yeah, that's also a question. Why it took so long? Where from comes this a bit obsession with her own body? When I look at her works, I have very strongly this notion of androgenic body. This is what I see when I look at her works. This is the let's say the impression I have. Of course, there is also what Aisha already mentioned, that there are those scales. From one side, her works are so intimate, but so quickly they get to this a bit almost post-human impressions, yes, that we really don't know what is it. This is some sort of a landscape that is built out of the body. She constructs some sort of new vision almost of a body.
Yeah. Do you think that, I mean, thinking about the body in the sense, and also the feverish nature of her skins, of her images, and then also, of course, of how young she was when she passed away, and her sort of almost like lifelong illness dealing with this, and her changing body and her images. Do you think this emphasis on the body and the skin is also in relationship to the illness that she was sort of grappling with for most of her life, most of her adult life?
I think this is one of the narrations we can build around Hannah Villiger's work. For me, it's very strong. Like when I read about her history of her illness and her visits in a hospital and how long she was there, and in fact from there she started to photograph her body. Of course, it's such a strong story that you start to be in this narration and to interpret her work through these lenses in a way. But I find that that's one of the narration for me very strong, and the one that I would I also followed in the text. I wrote that we can see also her obsession in the body as an effect also of being on this outside attitude to your own body, which she probably had experienced in a hospital, yes, when she went through different examinations, and her body, the way that body is treated in a hospital has this very body attitude, yes, that we stop to be ourselves, our body is just examined and it goes through those procedures which are a bit anonymous, and our body starts to be anonymous.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this like,
yeah,
oh, go ahead.
I think that is really an important point, and it has been discussed a lot. What importance does her illness play for her work? I don't know. I think on the one hand, I mean, she wasn't ill all the time. She had issues, but I think we shouldn't think of her as a person that had health problems all the time. She had from time to time, but so that is, maybe we shouldn't take it too prominently, or look at it too prominently when we think of her work. And the other thing, for me, the more and more I was working on Hannah Villiger's work, the more and more for me got important how everything is already there in her early work. Aisha, when you were mentioning the early work, everything is already there in her drawings, talking about the skin, talking about her own skin when she looks at the skin of the bark of a tree, or when she looks at fruits, and so the quality of the skin, the visual quality, the sensual quality of the skin, the fragmentation, it's already there. She cuts branches and they look like arms. They look like a cut by the photographic frame, cut then afterwards in her work arm. So, and you can also the performative, as Emily was talking about, that is already there in the beginning. She does performances. Then, for instance, she throws these palm leaves. She puts them on fire even. I think that is also an important, how maybe her own body somehow put on fire when she photographs it. So there's this energy in these palm leaves, and then she throws them through the air. And this also then you can link it to the performance aspect in a way that, I mean, the Polaroid camera is something very primitive as a medium. You can't adjust anything, you just hold it somewhere. And so if she moves, and she moves quite a lot in front of, then it gets blurred. And she works with series as well. That's also then the performative, that sometimes it's like stills from a film. If you think of the exhibition, the first large block that we're showing from mid-90s, there she's circling with the camera above of her head, and she's moving around. So it's like, yeah, like stills from a film. And also the posing is kind of a performance as well. I mean, sometimes it gets more and more complex in doing it over the years. And then when we look as a viewer, we try to understand what we see. And then we understand that it's how she's really, how she works with her limbs. She's not like making knots almost, and very complex. She takes very complex poses. So that is also kind of a performance, almost close to, I don't know, dancing, yoga, or something like that. How she moves then with her body in front of the camera.
I just wanted to say too that just to point it out, I mean, I think people mentioned it in the essay too, though, that since she always took these photographs herself, like the reason why they were so close was because it was the extension of her arm, you know. And so I think, and this goes back to this relationship, this kind of mirroring, that like when you approach her works, you're constantly thinking about the body you're seeing in relationship to your body. It becomes a kind of mirroring in some sense. And yet she was enacting that in the performance of her photographs. I mean, they're performance photographs in a sense, which links them very strongly to a kind of feminist practice and practices that are happening in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. But also to bring it back to this idea of language, I mean, thinking about her work as her body as the sort of site of her work, but not the subject of her work. And I think this is really interesting because if you think about this, like, as you said, this like compulsion to document her body over the course of her entire life, this like daily practice. And yet it seems to me like less autobiographical and more like a kind of autofiction, you know, that she's using herself, as you say, Madeline, as a character in a film, that it's like very cinematic. She's simply sort of a material. She's an actor to sort of act out these narratives and work out these ideas that she has about image making, about body, about surface, about skin, about gender, about technology, because what is the Polaroid? It was at the time a new technology. It was a new form of image making that was, as you said, like quite primitive. Yeah, and so I think these questions are there is this, I come back to it because we're in a moment now, I think, both in terms of the moving image and in terms of contemporary literature, and in terms of also like just contemporary art practice as a whole, that we're thinking about this term, the auto. So auto theory, auto fiction, auto ethnography. There's again this emphasis on like sort of meta narratives and meta fictions, where the distance between the maker and the character is kind of blurry, the distance between the document and the fiction. And it's interesting how much her work sort of is founded in this and predates this, and almost like prophecies the kind of place that we're at in terms of contemporary making culture today. And I guess, so that brings me to my question now for all of you. How do you think her work somehow influences, directly or not, practices by younger artists today, maybe even her peers, but also sort of contemporary practice that's coming out today, like sort of threading it to the work that she made?
Maybe to answer your question sort of indirectly,
yeah.
with something that also sort of ties on what Agnieszka and Madeleine just mentioned before about this question of what is sculptural about her work, what is photographic about her work, do these questions really matter? And I think just the fact that we're still sort of wondering and talking about these questions that, you know, we could go on and on about. I think what is very strong for me is, and this is true for her, really her whole oeuvre, is this experience of oneself as a subjective center. And this is very tied to questions of, I think, for someone who's a contemporary artist, where, you know, you don't really have necessarily those categories anymore of this is a photographer, this is a sculptor. The lines are very blurred. And I think that is something where Hannah Villiger was really a pioneer. I think of her work in terms of, for example, working with something that can be very sculptural, but at the same time making it what it is with technologies that are really tied to photography. I'm thinking, for example, of one of the 1990s blocks. I think it's from 93. It's from the Herzog and Dömerow cabinet. I think it's in the exhibition as well, where you have this block and the body really comes sort of, it looks like it comes out of the work almost, because the background is completely black or almost black. And that is a quality that is really tied to photography, because you cannot see a body like this without it being a photograph, right? Mm-hmm. So she's really employing and sort of also pushing the boundaries of this medium in order to create something that is then not even necessarily resembling a photograph, but that you could also talk about in terms of sculpture, right? And I think this is even true for Manon. You mentioned these palm leaves that she's lighting on fire, or there's also these black and white photographs of these of planes and zeppelins and these boccia balls that are sort of slammed together. And I think all of these can be tied to the same idea of energy and of the experience of mechanical forces, of gravity, and then at the same time sort of being contrasted with this embodied, intuitive knowledge of, you know, your own orientedness in the world. And so, I mean, in a sense, that sounds very general, but I do feel like in contemporary art practices, these are very central themes. And if you would introduce Villiger, I think, and she wouldn't be known, you know, you would never really be able to tell that she is not of this generation, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, just one thing that you say when you brought up seeing a work of hers installed, and it just made me think about this famous image from her solo show at Kunsthalle Basel, where she's sitting in the center of the room. I believe she's sitting in a chair with all of her blocks kind of surrounding behind her and on the walls around her. And there's such like a kind of frism and punctum to this photograph, this conceptual idea of her body on the walls as the sort of material and subject of the work, and then the maker of the work, but also her body as the audience, her body as the viewer. And I think, again, this also points to what you were saying. This goes beyond this kind of transdisciplinarity of being, you know, both a sculptor, a photographer, a writer, a filmmaker, a performer, a feminist artist, an artist interested in the non-human. And it also points to constantly thinking about the way that the viewer is going to engage with the work and constantly moving her body, cycling it through these roles. So she's the viewer, she's the material, she's the maker, she's the subject. Her body is always a site of each of these things. She plays all the roles. And yeah, I think that's quite interesting. What were you going to say, Manon?
I just wanted to add, coming back to your question, where do we see the link to contemporary art practice from the work of Hannah Villiger? I think for me, a crucial point is this point of the fluidity that we talked about earlier in our discussion. For instance, we see it very well in the three vertical blocks that we have in the exhibition in Susch, where the artist's body can no longer be recognized. So she has a very free and radical way of looking at the body or at her own body. It can not be reconstructed. She transformed it. She transforms it into something fluid between the genders, within creation, between human, animal, between human, plants. Like everything dissolves and becomes something new, something third, and that isn't that a theme that artists today are very much into and very much working on, and also in our society. This is topics that we are talking about. That also the last Venice Biennial, the main curated exhibition was very much circling around these topics. Mm-hmm. And there, Hannah Villiger, as Aisha was saying, if someone wouldn't know at all who the artist was, and you showed it in an exhibition with contemporary artists, you wouldn't say the work is 30 years old. You mm-hmm. really wouldn't.
Yeah.
I wanted to second, I guess, what Aisha and Madeleine have already said, going back to your question, Quinn, about what makes her work so impactful now. It's definitely got a sense of energy and fluidity, and I think this is due to the fact that I think you can really relate to it as a viewer. So as you were saying earlier, it's performative because it kind of calls into the viewer's emotions to experience it, and to experience it as a sculptural installation of their body in space. But also it calls for the viewer to respond to it, to think about this kind of unresolved nature of identity that everyone experiences. And Hannah has really spoken about that candidly, about having these different kind of personas in a way in creating her work. So she's talked about herself being the self-reflexive image maker, but she's also talked about her camera being the second person, or like a mechanical appendage to her. And then she's also talked about this idea of really talking her works reflecting her self-experienced reality. And this reality is something that traverses her all the way from the inside to the outside. So I think this is something that really the audience can respond to. And this question of identity, I think, is something that really prefigures and is really important in current artist practices.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe too, maybe this brings up this question, which is, maybe less central to her practice, and yet it's there from the beginning. And that's this, I think I maybe also relate it to this idea of the camera as a kind of prosthetic or an appendage, but also her interest in textiles and fashion and style and making and dress, because when you think about the body, you also think about what clothes it, or what unclothes it. And, you know, one of the, what she uses as another kind of skin is fabrics in different blocks. And so I was wondering how you guys approached that, because I think there's always, because of her work, there's so much emphasis on the sort of field as skin. But what about when these blocks and these fields are actually taken up with fabrics, with textiles, with color, with different kinds of folds? So it's not the fold of the skin behind the knee, but it's like the fold of a silk or an acrylic. And again, this like almost sort of cycling between the human and the non-human, the biological and the non-biological here. What do you guys think about this?
In this film that Edith Yu did on Hannah Villiger, there is this, she speaks about her skin, that her skin is like a dress for her. Also that she doesn't feel naked, but yeah, she's wearing a dress. And that's also interesting, I think, how she is treating nudity, and nudity is not something that has to do with intimacy for her.
Right.
But and then also we have to think about the last works where textiles, these very last blocks, there are 3 blocks where textiles are the main subject on the pictures.
Yeah.
So the body somehow behind these colorful textiles disappears behind these textiles. And yeah, but that was just a short remark regarding fashion, fabrics.
Yeah,
I think it really is quite, I mean, to me, it was very unsurprising to hear also from friends of hers that, you know, she was very interested in clothing and didn't have a lot of it, but very specific pieces that she really loved. Because when you think of it, you have, you know, after the skin, it's the, sort of the second layer of that surrounds your body, right? So if the skin is the dwelling and there's this exchange of outside and inside, the clothes are what sort of also protect you from that. And I mean, we've seen this with other artists, you know, I always sort of think of Louise Bourgeois, for example, who was so interested in the body, but it was also so interested in textiles and sort of what they mean, because they're the closest thing to the body in a lot of senses, not just when it comes to clothes, but also if you think of the bed, for example, and the textiles that you would have on the bed. And I know Hannah worked with a sort of a sheet that she would put on the floor. So she would have this very sort of small space that was closed, if you will. And so this direct skin contact with these textiles, I think, are very important. And I think there are 2 ways sort of in which she incorporates these textiles. One is where she would, as I think, Madeleine, you've already mentioned this work, or maybe you haven't, that very late work where the textiles sort of become the body, but there's also the aspect of the textile that is in the background. And that is also something that I think is so interesting when we think about photography, sculpture, and the role that sort of the foreground and the background play for her. And I think it's very interesting that this background is a textile one. So the gaps, I think, I don't know if Quinn, you talked about this in the beginning, the gap that is sort of, you know, ever present, almost as present as what is there, is something that is a main feature of photography, obviously. It's also a main feature of photographing sculpture, even in, you know, in an art historical sense, when you think about 19th century photography of sculpture, and there was a whole art of how do you, what angle is the best angle to sort of capture the 3-dimensionality of sculpture, etc. And the background would obviously play a very important part. And then this background is sort of, even in these blocks, is always contrasted or followed or resisted by the gaps between the plates, because there's always, the plates are never seamlessly put together. There's always this gap. I think it's always the same amount of, maybe Madeleine, you know how many centimeters are supposed to be in between those plates. But if you think about it, that's what makes the grid. That's sort of what makes it seem like a block that is, I think I say this in my text, that a block that you would, take apart and then put it in a flat way onto the wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, I think this, talking about the sort of background, the foreground and the background, and these kind of draped fabrics, both on the floor and behind, I think this leads me to sort of my other sort of, I don't know, idea about textiles and fabrics and their place in her work, which is, I think we often approach her work because of its methodology, because of its materiality, because of its images, in this very kind of self-serious way about authenticity and the body and the feminist body and so forth. But there is also something for me quite camp about Hannah's work. And there's something quite playful. And I think this is kind of also my interest in the textiles and in the fabrics, because also in images of her over her life, she had incredible style. And it was also like, it was sort of changing, and I was thinking about this again. I think this was Emily, you were talking about this fluidity of identity. And I was thinking about this, like, and Agnieszka, this compulsion of documenting, using her body as the site of her practice over her whole life. And the way that she was using her body, but as a kind of character, and she was sort of cycling through different ideas of that. And her skin was in some way one kind of dress up that she could use, but then the fabrics and the textiles and the clothes that she made were the other. And I think this is a kind of aspect of her work that sometimes not spoken about enough, because I think it's easier for us to go to the very like sort of serious and psychoanalytical, elements. But there is a kind of campy playfulness, and again, I guess in terms of ideas of identity and gender, there is also a bit of a queering here. I think that's moving it not just from the femme body, the gendered femme body, but to something sort of more non-binary, basically.
Can I respond to this one? I was going to say, there's definitely a fluidity at play, but for me, going back to specifically thinking about these fabric works, I see these works as quite erotic in a way, whereas a lot of her later work, you get the sense that her body's become frail. So whenever she's photographing it, you have less this kind of erotic tension that you have in her earlier works. So for me, in a way, these later works with fabric are really almost taking on a personality of itself, or like this desire that Hannah perhaps no longer feels within her own body. I really see these fabric works as thinking about desire, which I guess links back to what you were saying, Aisha, earlier about this relationship between skin and contact and intimacy.
And if I can add something about like the playfulness and the textile, like also one of the things that really like fascinates me, I think almost the most in Hannah Villiger's of why is this play you have between being really like naked, so uncovering, but at the same time not telling much about yourself. So somehow through sometimes this gesture of nudity, so really which we relate to telling everything about yourself, to being really like exactly like naked in the sense that you really you're just there. Somehow for me it's always there is this play of in fact hiding through nudity, as that when you approach her works, it's so intimate, and at the other side of this, it doesn't tell you a lot about herself. So I see here some sort of a play she builds also with the with the viewer, that you can in a way put another layer, a cover, through the gesture of becoming nude and taking off your clothes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think what we must not forget is also that, you know, when we sort of link the skin and these textiles, there is a stark difference that I think is very important, is that, and she also talks about this over and over again in her work diaries, that you cannot really change the skin you're in, right? And this is, I think, fundamental for her practice, that she's very aware of the fact that everything she does is sort of within the dwelling of her own skin, and that skin for me is marked, and it literally is. I think in the film that you mentioned, Madeleine, she also talks about, you know, having these freckles all over her body, and that they sort of give her body this painterly quality. So in a sense, her body is not just any body or a body, it is marked. And there's no way to really get out of that, or to have that not influence her experience of the world or her own orientedness in the world. And clothing, if you will, is a way perhaps to not cover that up, but to, you can call it play with it, or to sort of maybe expand that experience, or to sort of add a layer to your marked dwelling of, you know, that surrounds your being. And I do think that you're more free with clothing to sort of to sort of blur the lines, or to get out of sort of the shell that you're in.
I mean, it's interesting.
And in this,
yeah, go ahead.
And in this context, it might be just interesting to mention that she also painted on her skin. So there are quite a few works where she really adds color to her skin, or where also she, we don't know exactly how she did it, but she rubbed or something the skin and it gets red. So she, in one way she does it natural, the reaction of the skin gets red, and then she takes the picture, or she really adds paint. So we always talk a lot about this relationship with sculpture, and where she comes from, of course, also, but the relationship to painting is also an interesting topic in her work.
And just to say too that, like, I guess with the painting of the skin, but also with the clothing and the fabric and the textiles, I mean, dressing is a way of fragmenting and highlighting different body parts. You know, when we dress, we're, in some ways, what we're doing is we're also fragmenting the body. We're emphasizing certain parts of the body. And it's interesting because it feels like the eros and the eroticos that's in her methodology of taking photographs of these fragmented images of her body and reassembling them in these different sort of sentence-like forms is also there with the textiles, either as background or as dress, because they're also there to somehow highlight different parts. They're there to sort of emphasize difference and emphasize detail, basically. And I think when we think about the erotic and we think about eros, we're usually not thinking about totality. We're thinking about fragments. Fragments are our entryway to a sort of to an erotic imaginary or feeling or experience. And in some ways, she's like kind of, I think, playing with this idea in a way. And maybe this has to do, Agnieszka, with this idea of sort of liberation and control in some sense.
Yes, I think like to get to this, to the issue of erotics in her works, it's really interesting, because from one side, exactly, there are some works in which it's directly addressed, Yes, so there are the works in she's in fact like masturbating, and which are like almost on this edge of pornographic works. And then I think just there are of course some gestures, and I think this also comes to this notion of like that it's expressed, as you said, through the fragments also when you're in closes, that like for example through a touching of some parts of the body, which gets like very also erotic and sexual. That there are some, you know, in this fragments you have those that she's like also these gestures of touching. But of course, I think that's you know the voix of Hannah Villiger. It's so rich because there are many things that are like full of paradoxes. Yes, from one side a body, but then how it brings notion of still of erotics, and how her body still tries to. I really like this what came now in the what Aisha brought, this getting out of the shell. Yes, but still not really, you know, being able, because those things also as sexuality also stops you maybe in a way, yeah, also in your body, or where in fact in what she wanted to get out of her shell, she in a way could not. But what's like this vision of this new body? I don't know how you perceive it. Do you see that like this vision of a new body, of a body, would be still like sexual, full of erotism, or opposite? I would be also very interested to hear how you see it, because I'm not sure what is my really like, I don't have a clear answer. I'm like really rather in the process of thinking about it than giving really like clear answer. I see it in this work, but I'm really not able so quickly to give answer.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, just to say quickly, I think also that, yeah, just to point out the difference between eros and eroticos, and that eros, of course, has the erotic in it, but the eros is also tied very clearly to a kind of creative power. And so maybe even though the erotic is like definitely has its place, a very high place in Hannah's work, I think this idea of eros, like where she's finding, I don't know, I was recently rereading the famous Audre Lorde essay about eros, and about basically the erotic as a kind of, the eros and the eroticos as a place of female power that lies in the female body, in the female plane. And of course, there is something, you know, at the distance from the mid-70s when this lecture was given and then printed, there's a bit of distance, and there's in terms of a certain kind of feminism that it's practicing in this text. But I think that this is very interesting, that citing a certain kind of creative power in a certain gendered body, and thinking about that in terms of Hannah's work. And that doesn't mean that creative power comes out in gendered ways of, you know, looking like a certain kind of femme body or a butch body or this, but that the power itself is existing inside the body, and that this is where the eros is kind of springing from. I think this is an interesting idea to think about in terms of her work, because it's hard to, because of the power of it. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's an exercise of ideas that are based in the corporeal, in the body itself. I mean, it's interesting because I think when going back to language, everything in Hannah's work is like a mirror. So when you talk about her work, you're talking about her body of work, which is basically based in the site of her body. Like everything is sort of the Ouroboros, like the snake eating its tail, everything doubles back. And I think that's quite interesting somehow.
Yeah, I really, when I think more about the word desire than maybe the erotic when I think about her work. And I mean, I didn't make this up. This is literally something that she also sort of talks about in interviews. And I mean, we have her text in the publication, right? The Night Envy. And there sort of this tension between desire and envy and sort of this auto erotic, almost that is built on these two contrasting feelings of being envious and of desiring. And that is something that I feel like when we look at her oeuvre, these are two forces that sort of come together a lot, right? In the earlier works, we have this relationship with a woman where we have these two bodies that are almost indistinguishable from each other. And this goes even to the part behind the camera, right? We don't really know when it's Susan Bies who takes the picture, when it is Hannah. And this is not just a coincidence. She really, the way that she frames these pictures, we can see this in Madeleine's essay and also in mine with some of the examples, it's almost impossible to see which one is which, right? So here, desire and eroticism is sort of based on similarities and physical similarities. But she also has, and then, you know, if you think about it on societal terms, obviously it's Switzerland in the 1970s. I don't know how accommodating, you know, the society was of two women, being in a relationship in that way. I think we must not forget. But then she also has the experience of living in a heterosexual relationship, but still not really adhering to societal standards, because she's, with this West African man who is different from her in other terms, So I think for me, it really comes back to this idea of orientedness, like how do you experience the world around you? How does the world experience your being oriented in the world? And I think what is maybe quite striking, or I don't know if it's unique, but it's certainly not something you would come across all the time, is that she did have these multifaceted experiences that, and I think that is maybe a rare point of view that then translated into her works, that she would have the experience of what does it mean to be oriented in such a way, and then what does it mean to be oriented in a different way, and how does that sort of translate?
Yeah. I mean, she doesn't take herself, I guess, to bring it back to her body and the Swissness, but also her relationship and her relations and her negotiation between difference, is that she never takes her body, even though she's trying to turn her body somehow into a body, as she says, she never takes her body as like a kind of neutral canvas. Her body is always incredibly, incredibly specific. And it doesn't become a stand-in for everybody. It just becomes a body in which one can parse all these ideas about identity, about fluidity, about the human, the non-human, about language, about communication, about relations. Is there any, I'm wondering if maybe we should slowly wrap up. Are there any sort of ideas here that we didn't hit on that any of you thought were incredibly important and kind of central to her bodies of work that you would like to get to before we close this discussion?
Maybe just one remark. When I was listening to Aisha's last statement, I think what is important when we think of Hannah Villiger also as a person, how she was living her life and so on, how she was living her life as an artist, that I think she was really very courageous and very not doing any compromises. And that is something also that we were talking about, talking with quite a lot of younger artists that studied with her. And we were asking them what was the impression that you had of her? In what way was she a role model? What did impress you about her? And they said this. Her courage, how she no compromise, she with this certain radicality, I would say, she just took the road that she had to take, and she didn't look to the left or to the right. She just did her thing. And I think that is something that is true for most of the really interesting artists, that they are courageous, they just do their thing. And I think that is very true also for Hannah.
Yeah, I quite like the quote from Claudia and Julia Müller in the catalogue that talked about her kind of grammar forms as being controlled randomness. I thought that was a beautiful kind of summary of her practice, in a way, this idea that it's very controlled and specific, and on the one hand, but also very experimental on the other, and like just constantly open, just constantly experimenting. And yeah, it's a shame that her career was cut so short, because I would love to have seen where it would have taken her.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of beautiful too, this idea of the radicality of her life and her approach. And yet, in some sense, it seems like her sort of radical subjectivity as an artist and as a person and as a maker in the world also didn't separate her from others. Like, she was constantly in relationship somehow. And I think this is, actually, you spoke a little bit about this. And this is also, I think, somehow a profound part of her practice, as detailed and as cited as it is on her body. In her body is the entire world, and it is like communication, and it is in relationship with others. And I think that's one of the sort of very beautiful and powerful things about her body of work for me. So, if there's not anything else, maybe we will just wrap it up. I want to thank you all so much. It's when I first came to Basel over a decade ago, I went to the Museum für Gegenwartskunst, the Kunstmuseum's contemporary section, and they had some of her blocks in their permanent collection on display, and I had never heard of her work or seen it before. And it was a really profound experience for me. And so I kind of feel like my entire time in Switzerland, her work has been this kind of red thread across the way. And so it's been very nice the last few years, as more and more of her shows have been happening. Last year, being able to write about her work, this year, being able to be in conversation with all of you who are so deeply engaged with it. It's a really wonderful experience. So thank you.